So this is one of probably the more popular questions that most people did, the two-part question. So firstly, explaining how taxes and subsidies are differing in their effect on the market price and quantity of a good. Obviously, for this kind of question, it's drawing the graph, and most people did a graph for both taxes and a graph that showed subsidies. I think a really important thing to start with is actually this, is that for both of these types of products, you kind of classify them as being different types of goods, and taxes tend to be imposed on demerit goods, whereas subsidies tend to be provided on goods which are considered to be merit goods or even positive externalities of production or consumption. So that was a really good starting point that most people did. And from that, kind of a really good way to do that was to start having some examples. So people sort of had examples of, we subsidise things like education or vaccinations, early childcare. We tend to tax things like alcohol, petrol, those kind of products. So that split was quite nice to see from lots of students. So a little bit more on that first question. Here is just a quick example of a student's work. This kind of introduction, maybe this one's a bit too long for a student, but anyway, making the point here that price mechanism, demerit goods and merit goods, positive externalities, and the way they should be taxed, coming up with a diagram you can see below. Probably don't need two diagrams, but one of the diagrams showing the impact of the tax clearly labelled on the side, and even going slightly further and having a slightly inelastic demand curve is a good step. Think about, for top marks, maybe you're starting to talk about consumer burdens, but it's not necessarily needed for the question, to be honest. But you have shown here that that's the effect on the quantity and that's the effect on the price. And that links back to the question about how they differ. And then the second part is explaining the subsidy. Governments tend to provide subsidies to suppliers encouraging production. And be really careful here. The subsidy diagram does look like this, where to get from this quantity to this quantity, you have to provide this monetary subsidy, what's called a per unit subsidy of this amount, to get from that quantity to that quantity. A subsidy is not shown as that bit. There's not that distance between there and there. So this is correct on the side, showing the change in price, showing the change in quantity. People talked about this, so different grades of boundaries. So to get from a 7 to an 8, pretty precise diagrams, good definitions linked to merit and demerit goods. Getting to a 9 and a 10. These diagrams are perfect. So here you've got really clear shading for 9 and a 10. You've tied it really nicely to examples for both of the products. And your use of terminology is really, really precise. So you might use the words like positive and negative externalities. You might types of taxes, specific taxes and ad valorem taxes, and the detail that you might need for this. Okay, so that's just part A.